the recording. And I will just start. Carolyn is traveling in the Ecuadorian Amazon at the moment, which is all very adventurous. So she won't be joining us today. But I'll just start with the message on her behalf that she would, and we would like to acknowledge that wherever we are in the world today, the land where we are standing is the traditional territory of many nations. And we wish to acknowledge and thank the first people of this territory and other Indigenous peoples for sharing their land in order for us to continue our work. And welcome to everyone. Where's everyone calling in from today?
We have a few new faces. So
Texas.
Where in Texas?
San Antonio.
Okay.
In Seattle, Washington, in the US.
Okay.
And I'm Los Angeles County.
Okay.
I'm Central Ohio in the US.
All right.
I'm in New Jersey on the shore.
Hopefully having some good weather.
Yes.
The message from Mary Kay that she's near Detroit.
And Sherry, where are you calling in from? You may have to unmute yourself.
She might just be away from a keyboard
Yes.
for a moment.
Okay. So I'm
Well,
coming
I'm
to you
from
from,
Yep.
I'm coming to you from Alabama in the US.
And I'm in Australia, and I live in hope that at one of these JourneyWoman sessions, that somebody else is going to be here from our side of the pond. Although I was very lucky, she's not here today, but one of the JourneyWoman book club members, Anna, who's one of our regulars, was in Australia recently, and we got to meet up. So that was wonderful.
Hi, sorry, this is Sherry. I did step away. I'm also, believe it or not, on the Jersey Shore. Who said earlier they were on the Jersey Shore?
Peggy,
I did.
think.
I'm up in Keyport,
Who?
which
I'm
isn't
sorry.
quite the Jersey Shore. It's north,
Oh,
Yeah.
a little bit north.
Peggy.
Peggy.
Oh,
Oh,
this
it's
is
Peggy.
Peggy.
Hi. Okay. Hi, Peggy. Yeah, I'm in Ocean Grove, New Jersey, between Bradley Beach and Asbury Park.
That's lovely down there. I love the boardwalk.
And Linda, where are you calling in from?
Me, I'm from Los Angeles County.
Oh, okay. Okay. We heard from you earlier. It's just that your picture is not on. so
Yeah,
that-
I don't know what's going on with my computer. It's starting to act weird.
Okay. Well, let's get started. Today's book is called Still Life. And let me pull up my notes. It's interesting to me because it was a long book. And although it was quite a lengthy book, to me, it was worth it because the characters were so well developed. But we'll get into the book in a minute. Let me tell you a little bit about the author. She is an actress from the UK. She's been in some things that maybe some of you may have heard of. Let me see some of them. She was in Midsummer Mysteries. Let's see what else. I wrote down a few things she's been in. Call the Midwife. And I'm not finding my list, but a number of other sort of PBS type or shows that we see on PBS. She started writing, this is her fourth book. A couple of her, and I want to go back and read a couple of her others. Tin Men was her one that she did right before this one, which unlike this one, it was quite a short book. So she went from a very short book to this more lengthy. When she talked about why she wrote the book and what her inspiration was. And she started off because she wanted to write about Florence and the flood. She'd been to Florence and she'd gone to a restaurant and seen pictures on the wall of this flood that she'd never even heard about in the 1960s. And so that was her first thing was to write about the flood. The other thing she said, she was writing it just post-Brexit. And it was a time when she wanted a reprieve from the hatred that Brexit brought out. And she wanted to write about unity and togetherness and what she calls the joy of resistance. And so this whole idea of unity and bringing people together from various places, you know, Europe and England, because if you notice, our characters are from England, but they take place in Italy. So it's the sort of the Europeanness of the stuff. So that was her entry point, was the flood. And she also talked a lot about the angels of mud, because that's what these young people were called. So this is the mid-60s, and people came from all over to help with the cleanup, and they were called the angels of mud. And so she said, sort of with that spirit of, you know, youth and people getting together and helping each other out, was kind of where she came for this novel was coming from. She is a traveler herself, but she wanted to, the other thing that I thought was really interesting is she said she wanted the book to be about not much. In other words, nothing big is happening except for the lifespan of these friends. And that to her, what was important was, yes, things happen in our lives, right? Good things, bad things, but nothing horrendously out of the ordinary. But it was that the lifespan of these friends being together that she wanted to show in the book, which I think she did very well. She herself is a gay woman. And she talked a little bit about her philosophy of writing about homosexuals during this period of time. From the standpoint, she said, you know, it was a very difficult period of time because it was still illegal and people were closeted, etc. But she wanted to write how it could have been, you know, so the joy beneath it all. So so we see some of that in some of the relationships. So that's all I have found out about her. She is working on another book now, has not told us much about what it will be about, but I'm interested to find out what she is. One of the things I really enjoyed about her was, again, this development of characters, which I thought was so strong, as well as her descriptions. I thought were very, it really told, I could see what was happening. I could see the pub. I could feel the pub, what was happening inside the pub, etc. So with that, let's start out with, before we talk about the book, who's traveled to Florence before? And did you see or feel anything familiar in the book? Thoughts about Florence?
I loved it. I was lucky enough that I did a semester abroad in Florence back in '82, so it's a long time ago. But yeah, so many of the things that she wrote about, I was like, okay, I've been there. I've been on that corner and walked around that square and done that sort of thing. So I loved the way I went back with the book. And you talk about the flood too, and I knew all about the flood, but I loved her description of it. In fact, of all the parts in the book, that section about the flood was the one that spoke to me the most for some reason. So I didn't know that was her starting point. So that's interesting.
Anybody else have some thoughts on Florence?
Well, I've been to, can you hear me? Because
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
I can hear you fine, Linda.
I get a Zoom not responding and all I can see is fuzzy, but you can hear me. That's great. I've been to Florence a couple of times and I found, and I loved going to Florence and her story, and the flood fascinated me because I guess I knew about it, but I didn't know about it.
Yeah.
But as with so many books I read anymore, I'll be reading about some plaza that she's at and just hanging out at some church or whatever. And I have to Google it to find out exactly where it is because I think I've been by it, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
So me and Google Maps spend a lot of time in these books.
Yeah.
I love that, Linda. For me, the mark of success of a good book is how often it sends me to Google Maps, Google Translate, Google Images, even the dictionary.
Exactly.
And yeah, this was definitely one of those that had a fabulous sense of place where you could really track where she was going.
Mhm.
Oh, Google Pictures for sure. Every time she brought up an artwork, I would
Oh, yeah.
Google to see what she was talking about. Yeah.
I see lots of people nodding. I think a lot of us were doing that.
Okay, so what were people's favorite passages? Normally I start with one, but I couldn't find one. So Peggy, you want to start with one?
Well, there's two things. You talked about the flooding, and it sort of reminded me, did everybody read or anybody read Their Eyes Were Watching God?
Yeah.
And the
No.
hurricane passage, chapter, what section, as it comes across Florida. And this is what that reminded me of, like this awful weather event that they didn't know was coming because you didn't have weather.com, you know, and it was just, you know, unbelievable. My favorite passage was when they were talking about the choices for women. Either you could get married or go to the nunnery. And I didn't realize that the nunnery wasn't so bad after all. You get to write and paint and you know, do all kinds of things. And I was like, wow, I didn't realize. I thought you spent the time on your knees or something, you know. So I love that bit of information I didn't have.
It might depend on the nunnery.
Yeah.
Yeah, that whole concept was fascinating to me, and that drive that many people have to write or to create art, which is something that is, I think, even when you talk to artists and writers, it's hard for them to put the finger on what it is that's deep inside their soul that drives them, because it's not always fun to do those things. It's hard and have such a strong drive to do it. But it did open up a whole new aspect to think for women. If they had that drive in that time, they were willing to give up the world, family, love, freedom, just to
Well, I don't
spend
know
that.
if being
to
married is free, but go on.
But freedom to move around, you know, freedom to not be confined to a cloister. And
Of course, their other choice
do
was
it
to
to
be
write.
confined in the kitchen. So I'm not sure that, again, the
Yeah.
freedom is.
It's all
Yeah.
relative here.
Isn't it? Yes.
Yeah.
I think the thing that really delighted me, I guess I would say, was the unexpected things, like with Cress and his conversations with the trees. And also Claude. I adored Claude. You know, it would take me off guard, and it would take me a few minutes. I'd go, oh, wait, right, that's right. He's a parrot, you know, and he's saying these amazing things. And there was that threading, very lightly done, of magical realism in it. And there was this voice, you know, it was like, well, this happened to Peg, but that's a story for another time, you know, kind of that omniscient voice. And it just, you know, so much of this book would take me off guard and just delight me and surprise me. And it was, I mean, it was so dense. Yes. And there were people coming in and out. I mean, before we started, I've got about 100 pages left to go in the book. I had to go back, and because I couldn't remember who Arturo was, who had left all this money. And I thought, you know, and I knew he had met him, but I couldn't quite remember what, you know, so I was flipping back through the book. And there were a number of characters like that who kind of dropped in. And then there was a thread, you know, 100 pages later that picks their life up again. So I just, yes, I thought it was really skillfully done. And I, you know, it was a gorgeous book.
But one of the things, one of the areas that I liked was when he, when Ulysses first moved to Italy, and everybody knew him. You know, he'd walk into a store and people would, and I remember when my sister became principal in a little tiny town, and she moved to the town, and she would talk about how she'd walk in the grocery store and strangers would walk up to her and welcome her to town because they all knew who she was, even though she knew who none of them were. And so it kind of reminded me of that, you know, the people have in a small area, they know their neighborhood, they know who's there. And when someone new comes in, you know, they were really embracing him. So that was one part I really liked. The other part, and it just sticks in my mind a lot, was the first time that, I don't remember the pub owner's name. But the first time that he drove to Italy and drove up with the ambulance blaring and honking his horn, and everybody came out on the streets to see what he was. And I thought, what a character, you know. Yeah, Patricia.
I was going to say one of the other things I loved about this book was A Room with a View. Ian Forster is A Room with a View has been one of my favorite books for years and years. In fact, I had to go watch the movie last weekend just to refresh myself. But especially that whole last chapter, all about Evelyn. Yep. And how many parallels there were. I just loved that. And I had to keep going back, and I picked up my copy of A Room with a View and compared characters and things like that. And one section that I'd like to read if I could, when Miss Skinner and Miss Everly first meet, and she says, "Tell me what you saw when you looked out of your window for the first time." And then she said, "I saw a lone rower carving across the Arno. The foothills were darkening. The cypress trees around San Miniato were topped by a ghostly mist. Ochre walls appeared more golden as the sun softened. Lights appeared throughout the city and took their place on the surface of the river." And just that sort of description that she wrote there, I just thought was beautiful. Yeah. And the whole references back to Ian Forster and The Room with a View were humorous at times, but it had a connection there that I enjoyed.
And clever, because some of the comparisons between characters, and I don't remember the names of the characters in The Room with a View, but that relationship between Miss Everly and Miss Skinner is, it mirrors the relationship, but is so much more beautiful and healthy than that disappointing scene in The Room with a View when she gets taken out to the cathedral and gets deserted there. So it was very cleverly done that it mirrored, but also just
enhanced
a little bit around. Yeah. I had two favorite passages, two quite short passages, and I think they both speak to me about the emotional depth to this book. Because it was this amusing, funny story and lovely story, and every now and then something would just pierce me, you know, to the core, and it would be so understated. One of them, I won't even read it because I'll probably cry, is the very last 3 lines of the book, when Ulysses is remembering Captain Darcy, and it made me think about remembering my niece who died in a travel accident. But the other one, which really spoke to me, was there was a time when Pete was playing the piano, and it just flashed between the different characters listening to his music, and there were just these very tiny insights into how Pete's piano playing, how his music was speaking to each of them. And there was one where Crest it said the music led Crest to his mum. 6 kids, no money, and only a view from the sink. Christmas, just another day. The time he learned that she too had dreams. Hard to reconcile that pain. Has taken a lifetime and still not there yet. And that made me think about the time in my life when, for the first time, I was able to recognize that my mother was a woman, a full woman, a 3-dimensional person, and not just mommy who had looked after me, and also some pain of regret of not having been able to relate to her in that way when she was alive. So that one really got me.
Anyone else? So the next thing is the book's title, Still Life. You know, it has, that can have different meanings. And so what are the relevant meanings that you found in the book? To me, there were two obvious ones. One is still life, as in a portrait, as in a picture, as in, you know, this is the way things look. And the other was, it's still life. You know, life goes on, it's still life. So those were the sort of the two. One is it's a snapshot of a picture, and the other is this continuity of life going on.
I had the same question. I was kind of hoping you'd give us the answer on what the author may have meant, because I had the same
she did not say that. Unfortunately, that was not one of the things she revealed. So
I actually did read an article, and I'll just pull it up while we chat about this. for me, there was also the idea of serenity. Like as you said in the beginning, Wendy, it wasn't a book that was, although there was a massive amount that happened in the book, it wasn't a book that had a typical kind of build up to a climax and then
Right.
have your denouement.
Right.
And so there was this beauty of quite a serene existence that they had there, and also kind of still in the terms that they settled in a new place and stayed still there after moving. But she does write something about
Okay.
she wrote something about the art aspects. She said that's how she started with the there was a Vanity Fair yeah, she had read a book by someone called Norman Bryson, which was 4 essays on still life painting. And she said that was a starting point for her because he'd made her think about how the gaze of women had been so removed from the artworks that had the still life artworks that had become famous through history. And that she tried to bring that through in Evelyn Skinner's attempts to write an introduction to still life painting for her students. So she did say that, and I believe there was something else she wrote. I'll see if I can find the links and just pop them in the chat.
Okay, good. So there are a couple of unusual characters, as we talked about the parrot, unusual speakers, the parrot, and then Cress talking to the trees. So the question is, did you have a favorite moment with either of these? And have you encountered similar characters or others before?
Before what?
In other books, I'm sorry.
Before reading this
Oh, in
book,
other books.
in any other books that you've read. Because
That's kind of, you know, if the others of you are like me, I read lots of books.
Yeah.
So
It's a
I think
loaded
it's a-
question.
yeah, it's kind of a hard question.
Yeah.
That I would say the biggest thing that struck me about this was that notion of it redefined sort of a family to me, because these people create a family. And I had to remind myself from time to time that the kid, Alice, wasn't related to Ulysses in any way. And, you know, that they all they coalesced into an amazing family.
Yeah, it was
And
almost like,
I would say that I haven't read any other book that really addressed that theme as well as it did in this book.
you know, if you think about it, the jazz player was the uncle, you know, and Cress was the grandfather. And, you know, I mean, you're right. That sense of family I felt was very, very strong. One of the things too is the typical feminine roles of motherhood and mothering really took place by the men in this story,
Yeah.
you know, and that's another interesting twist to it, that they were the ones, they were the caregivers, they were the ones who were there for someone else, whereas the women were more out doing their own thing. So it's a flipping of the reversals as well. And then Evelyn herself, I always thought of what role was she in the family? Well, was she sort of the mother figure for Ulysses in one sense, or like the great aunt? I'm not sure, but you're right, that feeling of chosen family as opposed to was very, very strong.
Yeah.
One of the other things I liked, and you mentioned it briefly there, is how throughout life, once Ulysses moved back to Florence, how Evelyn and Ulysses almost crossed paths and didn't cross paths. How many times that happens, and it makes you think, how often does that happen in real life, that you know, they were this close to running into each other for how many times over 20 years and never did until the very end. So it's interesting, the coincidence in there.
Mhm.
And yet that didn't feel forced.
No,
Right.
it didn't.
It was lightly done enough. And, you know, I mean, there's certainly been small examples in my life where, you know, later on you'd say, oh my gosh, you were there. Well, I was there too. And I wish I'd known you were there, sort of thing. And, you know, that happened. They just, you know, passed so close.
There's so much about this book that doesn't feel forced. Pamela, earlier you were mentioning about Claude the Parrot. And I read the book twice. I read once not too long ago, maybe 3 or 4 months ago, but I have very poor retention. I don't remember details of what I read. And of course I remember the parrot because, you know, the parrot is awesome. And when I came back to reread it in preparation for today's meetup, I was expecting that Claude and his little pithy little comments that he makes, I was expecting that I remembered it as being something that happened much more frequently in the book. And reading it again now, she's so clever. The author is so clever because it would have been a very easy mistake to overdo it, to overdo Claude's role in the story. But she holds back just enough that each time it comes, it's this delightful moment of awareness of Claude and his personality. And again, it's something that's not forced. It's something that's just beautiful.
Okay, next question. After his move to Florence, Cress discards his 19th century travel guidebook that features a room with a view. How do you feel about guidebooks? Do they enhance your travels or limit them? And do you have a favorite series?
I've never used them myself, so I don't know.
I read them before I go and then don't take them with me.
Mhm.
I'm a big fan of the guidebook. I'm one of those people that walks around clutching a lonely planet. But I agree that that you have to be careful they provide the starting points, I think. And I'm very grateful for everything I've found out in my guidebooks that I might have missed if I didn't know they were there. But you have to allow yourself to break away from their proposed itineraries.
And I think too, the times have changed. Back in 1980s, when I lived in Florence, you had to have your book. You had to have your Let's Go Europe with you because that's the only way you knew where the hostels were and where the trains were and that kind of thing. You had to. You didn't have your little cell phone with your internets on it. And so I think our iPhones have become our guidebook in many ways.
And that's quite interesting, actually. I hadn't thought about it quite like that, but you know, the Baedekers that which I think was just about the only guidebook at the time, and that played such a strong role in A Room with a View and was picked up here, although he discards it pretty soon. Yeah, it's almost like kind of a metaphor for the passing of time, isn't it? There was the Baedeker generation, and then there was our kind of generation 20 years ago traveling, where yeah, you not only would I be clutching my lonely planet, but everywhere I went, I'd see other people clutching lonely planets. And now, yes, for a lot of it just happens. You just Google something the night before.
Right.
You know, it's the book is filled with references to other creative works by both real and imagined. You know, there's music, there's film, there's literature, there's paintings and sculpture. How did this impact your reading of the book?
Well, I think we've chatted about how it sent a whole lot of us to Google image search.
Yeah.
Something that it made me think about the scene of the volunteers working to save the art from the flood. That reminded me a lot of a recent event that happened. Well, I say recent, it was in 2020, in the middle of lockdowns, that happened in Cape Town in South Africa when a fire burnt down a university library. And yeah, just images of chains of people, you know, all masked up, just salvaging the books, salvaging what books they could. The ones that had been burnt were gone forever, but the ones that were in the basements that had been waterlogged from the firefighting, and that those books were, most of those were, it was a university library, most of those were books that did not exist in digital form or wouldn't be, you know, they were rare books. And that just made me think a lot about art and what we're prepared to do about art and how we're prepared to come together to save it. And then that sent me looking for how there's a fabulous image of how Michelangelo's David was protected from bombs during the war. So it took me down a whole rabbit hole of art and how we protect it.
One of the things it reminded me of is the sculptures and the fountains in Italy and in Spain, how they're just everywhere, and where we don't have that, at least in the US. There's a few, Kansas City has some fountains, and there's a few sculptures here and there, but it's not like it is in Italy, where around every plaza there's some kind of a wonderful piece of sculpture. Mm-hmm. And how that really played a part in just their daily lives, is that viewing of these beautiful works of art.
Mm.
And some of the descriptions of the sculptures were very nice descriptions I hadn't heard before. Maybe I had seen the sculpture, but reading the descriptions that they had in there were wonderful.
Mm-hmm. I also, the Evelyn's whole role in the beginning of the book, which was to get some of the artwork out and to hide it and stuff. I hadn't thought about some of that. I mean, I think we're all aware, or at least I know I've always been aware of the German taking of many pieces of art, mm-hmm. but I hadn't thought about the resistance movement to prevent that. And so the other side of it, what was happening, wasn't even aware that was happening during the war. Now, Sally, you have a question, and you're going to have to help me with this one. Did you spot a passing reference to JourneyWoman?
Yes. Did anyone else see it?
No. I even went back to look for it. I did find a section towards the end of the book, when Evelyn was young, and she's talking about going to a restaurant and asking for a table, and they're like, "Oh, you're by yourself?" She's like, "Yes," but yeah, I didn't see. So Journey, help me out, Sally.
My thinking was not quite as lateral as that. It was actually, there is a fictional artist. Oh, and that's something else where art kind of affected my reading of the book, because I spent a lot of time trying to Google to see which of these authors and architects and artists were actually real life people and which ones are characters in the story. But Dorothy Cunningham, Dottie, is a fictional artist. And at one point it says, when they're talking with Jem, it says, he delivered a swift and wholly competent critique of 3 of Dottie's most famous pieces, JourneyWoman, Maria, and Arrested Time. So it was the name of one of the artworks.
Yeah.
Very cool.
That was a sneaky question I put in there because I was just amused by it. And it wasn't something I'd noticed on my first reading of the book. It was only something I picked up on the second read.
And that's the wonderful thing about reading on Kindle, is that you can search for that and find it. So
that's right.
Did you search?
Just now.
Now, Sally, you touched about this earlier about the fire in South Africa, but have any of you experienced a natural disaster like the flood that was depicted in the book and its aftermath? And did the description and the way that people reacted to it ring true to you? I lived through Hurricane Andrew and its aftermath. I was living in South Florida at the time. And to me, the way that people gathered together and the unity that disaster brought was really very, very comforting for people. We all worked together. For those of us that did have electricity, like at work, I would go into some of my friends were without electricity for a month or more. And so at work, if those of us that had electricity, we would make ice all night and bring in ice and give it to the people who didn't, so that they would, so we had this constant exchange of ice and exchange of food and bringing blankets, and like my camping Coleman stove I gave to them so they could have something to cook on. And, so that kind of how natural disaster brings out sometimes the best of unity. It can bring out some really horrible things as well, but it can bring that unity. That's one of the things I saw and felt from the book.
Yeah.
Anyone else been through those kinds of disasters? And
Well, like you, just several hurricanes in my life.
Yeah.
But I grew up on the Gulf Coast, Houston and Louisiana. So yeah, several hurricanes. I could Harvey, Katrina,
Yeah.
Andrew, I think was there. So yeah.
My sister runs a wildlife here, that wildlife sanctuary here in Australia, and we had very big fires a few years ago in 2019, just horrendous fires. And she had to evacuate all the animals in the park. And something that she did, which other zoos and parks didn't do, is not only to evacuate the captive animals, because that's relative. Well, it's not easy. It's not easy to do, but it's relatively easy to get to actually physically capture an animal that's in an enclosure. But her park also has a lot of emus and kangaroos and wallabies just hopping around in the bush. And she put out a call for volunteers because she was determined not to leave a single animal behind. And yeah, volunteers came, and it was an incredible experience. But this book also recalled to me that there's the side to it that people don't always think about. It's amazing when people come and volunteer spontaneously, but you also need someone to think about how you're going to feed them,
Yep.
and how you're going to house them, and how you're going to, get them water. Like so that was something that was interesting when I saw how the little pension that Ulysses and Cress run, and how they took in those volunteers.
Mhm. Another thing the book challenges is the dominant gender expectations of settings, time, and place. Can you think of examples? Now, I did bring up the fact that, from a gender expectation, that Ulysses really was serving that feminine mothering role. Other thoughts about different gender expectations throughout the book?
I think they occupied the feminine space, not just in the mothering role, but even food was a very strong theme
Yep.
throughout the book.
Mhm.
And it was generally the men who were providing the meals.
Yep.
So they were nourishing the others, not just emotionally, but also with food, which is
Mhm.
something that women usually do,
Mhm.
or certainly in that time period.
Yeah, and I think in that sense, it was a very refreshing book because it was, it wasn't like a big political statement,
Right.
but there was very much the treatment of the gay community, for instance. Everything about that seemed so natural, so unweird,
Yeah.
And for Evelyn, I mean, it was interesting how she comes full circle, and then she's very mothering toward the end there with Peg,
Yeah.
who's a rather prickly
Yeah.
character. So for her to be mothered by Evelyn, that was interesting. So I think in that sense, the characters in this book, what made it so engaging is nobody seemed to be defined by their gender.
Mhm.
That really, the whole thing with Peg, who couldn't mother Alice, but she could mother Ginny, so those were just, it was just, and I think it was that notion of family. Once again, it was so fluid.
And even-
was alliances.
Even the whole notion of Ginny, whose mother had abandoned the family and was raised by her bartender father, I guess. Her father was the bartender.
Yes.
Right.
It wasn't until the end of the book that I realized that Ginny was mentally disabled in some way. I don't know if y'all picked up on that. So
Yeah.
here we have a male bartender who is raising a mentally challenged child,
Mhm.
which was an interesting switch. And that in that situation, the mom had abandoned the family. Peg abandoned her children. So it was the women that were abandoning your children.
Yep.
Yep.
Were those the only two blood relationships? I'm trying to think now. There was Peggy and Alice, and there was Cole and Ginny. Were there any other people in this, this gorgeous, far-flung, found family that were related by blood? I think
I
that would
don't
be the
think
only
so.
I
two.
think so. And that's the
Cole
same.
was Cole was
Oh.
such an interesting character, Jenny's father, because he wasn't in many ways he wasn't a very nice person, and there were some hints that in his youth he might have been more than just not a nice person. I mean, there was some kind of,
It was a
I
rough
got the
neighborhood.
impression that he was an abuser in the relationship with his wife,
Right.
and that was why she left. I'm not sure if it
Right.
was physical abuse or some other kind of abuse. And he was a character that, you know, he wasn't the favorite for any of them to spend time with, but they still loved him. They still treated him with love, and he, as a character, I think, redeemed himself significantly from what clearly was a very problematic young manhood that he had. But through his relationship with his daughter and his relationship with his friends, he grows and he redeems himself quite significantly.
We know this concept of found family, that's a theme throughout the entire book. And there are, you know, the cast of characters, some of them are deeply flawed, and yet there's a great love between them. Which of the characters or relationships between characters appealed most deeply to you? One of them that for me was interesting was, and it was very short-lived, and forgive me, I don't remember the captain's name. But the very beginning,
At the very beginning.
at the
Yeah.
very
Darnley,
beginning,
I think.
Yes.
the
Yes.
relationship between Darnley and Ulysses, I thought was a very strong, loving relationship.
Mm.
And the fact that every year Ulysses went back to his grave, and you know, so I think there was a true deep love between them. Whether or not it was a physical love, one never knows, but there was a true love between these two men. And I think that started out that entire book for me in terms of it was going to be about relationships.
Mm.
Yes. Yeah.
What are some of the other relationships that appealed to you? I also like the jazz, and again, I'm bad at character names. The jazz singer or the jazz musician, the piano player.
Pianist,
Yeah,
Pete.
Peter.
Yeah, I really liked his relationship with Ulysses and with Alex, and just that whole role that he played sort of between the two groups of people, you know.
There was also, what was his name? Massimo, the Italian.
Yeah, yeah, Massimo, yes.
Italian.
Yeah,
I liked him, you know, he just sort of fell into their lives because he was the lawyer, I guess, or, you know, the real estate guy that said, here's your condo or here's your apartment. But yet he stayed in their life. And again, there was that question, was there a relationship? Was it just friends, just familial, or was there more to it? And you never really knew.
yeah, yeah.
And I think that was, I really liked that about this book. And it's interesting because it's a female author, right? A gay female author. Because it doesn't matter. I mean, it's like you said, it's the relationships that matter. It's not, you know, what they do in the bedroom, you know,
Right.
who cares? I mean, it's more about how they continue to support each other. Flawed as all of them were very flawed, but they found a place where they could be themselves and were, you know, accepted. Yeah. I mean, I liked Ulysses. I mean, he just seemed like the glue, you know, and I think it was, you know, once again, it opens with him, and, you know, that's why I had to go back and figure out who Arturo was. He was the one out on the roof who was going to end his life. And, you know, once again, the blow by blow description of the townspeople watching that drama unfolding and say, oh, well, he's got such a nice smile, you know, oh, he's, you know, smoking a cigarette. So the whole thing was, he was so calm and everybody trusted him. And I think that really set that foundation for the whole grouping that came along.
I was like you when I saw Arturo's name later. It surprised me because when you have a book that's 400 pages, I have a tendency to say, yeah, she could have left that section out. And at the beginning, I was like, yeah, why did we have to hear about this guy on the roof?
Yeah.
It was an interesting part, but I thought, okay, that's not going to impact the story later on. But then again, it does. So, and I too had to go say, okay, who's Arturo?
Yeah.
Right.
The main story spans 35 years, which is a long time for a story, from 44 to 79. And then the final chapter jumps back to Evelyn's youth in 1901. What did you think about the way that the author chronicled the passing of time? And do you think it captured, the feeling of each era?
I think she did a magnificent job of that by just giving us glimpses of news events that would be familiar to us, from Martin Luther King to the moon landing to these events, but she never belabored them. They were just passing references, but they were enough, I think, to ground me in the passing of time. And I loved that the little riff that she did at the end of each decade of, what have the 50s ever done for us? What have the 60s ever done for us?
Right.
I think she captured that beautifully.
Yeah. And she had different characters that were different ages, which helped it too. So Alice was the hippie generation. And so she had just different people that were different ages that helped that too.
And I think also it was little subtleties. And I think you asked Sally earlier, you mentioned the understatedness, but the little subtleties, like the description of clothing, also could give us passage of time, for example.
Or references to what the young people were doing now.
Yes.
Yes.
And the technology, the telephone,
Yes.
and how that evolved. Like in the beginning of all of this, there was one telephone in the restaurant sort of thing. And as we go along, then everybody has telephones and the technology comes along. So that was
the
also a
reference
marker
with the party line.
Yes.
and Des and the plastics that were going to save the future.
Right.
That's
right.
Yes.
And when Cress dies, he said, I thought he'd never die. I thought he was plastic.
Yes.
I didn't pick up on that reference.
I just read it. That's why.
The postscript takes us to the world of the room with the view. And Miss Evelyn introduces us to Florence in a gorgeous scene that contrasts with the other unpleasant interaction between Forrester's characters. Have you ever had a single person open your eyes to the wonders of a travel destination?
I had a tour guide, like just a walking tour guide in Athens, my very first day on my very first trip to Greece, who I think he must have been a true son of the orators of old, because he was so charismatic and his whole body just bristled with his enthusiasm for and his love for his city and his country. And that, I think, was a trigger for me to approach that whole trip in a way that was really hungry for everything the country could offer me. I don't know if it would have been the same if I hadn't had that interaction.
Yeah, I had one year when I was spending time in Venezuela, there was a man I worked with so I was in Venezuela at work with a Colombian woman, and this one particular guy took us one weekend, and he is, again, his love for his country, and he was taking us all over to these little unknown spots, something you would never read about, never hear about, and often off the beaten path, fascinating places that he really opened my eyes to how a travel destination is not necessarily the guidebooks. It's getting to know the locals who can show you those really interesting little places. And that really opened my eyes to how to travel going forward. So.
With me, it was definitely was my father, when I was in high school, because we're from England, and my father was in the Navy during the war. And so the pictures he would paint of going to Morocco and India and the Middle East, and Africa, that just that just infected me. It's like, and I may never get there in my lifetime, but once again, it was just that he was so enthralled with everything he'd seen. And once again, the tastes, he always said that he came back to America because he'd never had hot dogs before. And, they docked in the Brooklyn Navy Yard and he had a hot dog and sauerkraut. And he said it was the best food he'd ever had.
Pamela, you brought up an interesting point. In fact, the author, in one of her discussions, was talking about how the war itself, although was tragic, that for many people, what it did is it provided a level playing field that people that would never have had the opportunity to travel and to see other places and the cultures, and how it really leveled out a lot of that. And I thought that was a really interesting perspective. And here you actually brought it up. Your father was able to see all these wonderful places. So that was actually one of the things that the author had talked about, that the one good outcome of the war was that it allowed that to happen.
Yes, I'd say so.
Well, ladies, we're almost out of time. We only have about 5 minutes left.
Yep,
And
I do have a couple of housekeeping
yes,
announcements at the end,
right,
just don't let me
exactly.
forget.
So before we go, let's do on our hands 1 to 5. How did you feel about the book?
Oh, I always forget to bring up my spreadsheet.
I loved the book. I
Yeah.
really did.
Me
I
too.
think we'll just do it this way.
Yeah. So I think it was a successful book, one we can suggest to others in the future. So
I haven't read it yet,
Absolutely,
and
yes.
I've just been sort of listening in, but I'm
good.
going to read it. I have.
Kimberly, you'll love it. It's just,
You'll
it's
love
long,
it.
but it's the character development, the characters make it worthwhile. It is really an excellent book.
Well, thanks for letting me listen in on your discussion. It was great.
Yeah, no problem.
I
Thanks,
hope we didn't
Kimberly.
spoil anything.
Yeah.
I don't think so. I mean, it'll probably enrich it, to tell you the truth.
And I think that because that's something that's interesting to me when I was trying to write about this book. There's so much that happens, but it's very hard to encapsulate it, because what fascinates, and the story is great, Kimberly. You'll find the story, the plot is fantastic. It's really, really interesting. But it's the characters and the setting that pull you in so deeply, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it's quite
absolutely.
hard when if somebody says to you, "What is this book about?" Yes, you could answer them in a one sentence phrase, I guess, if you're better at encapsulating your thoughts than I am. But it doesn't matter if you know some of what's going to happen in the plot, because it is so gorgeous in the way it pulls you in.
Yep.
Can't wait.
Great.
I do have is it okay for me, Wendy, just to
Yep.
mention a couple of things?
Yep.
So just a couple of things. Our next book is also a long one, which I didn't realize until I downloaded it. I think it's even longer than Still Life. So don't leave till the last minute if you can help it. It's got very high reviews, but it is a book that is released under 2 titles, which I know can always be a bit confusing. So it's released as The Seamstress and also as The Time in Between. I think The Time in Between is the US edition. But if you're struggling to find it under one name, maybe try under the other. It is the same book. The author is Maria Dueñas. And I don't think the registration link is up yet, but it will. I'll just I'll put in the link for the page, the general book club page. That's where the link will appear. But also I'm going to put in another link, and I have dropped some links in the chat while we've been talking. I'll do this one again. We are about to vote for our next book. So we've got another short list of 12 books that has gone through a very, very rigorous process of trying to winnow down ideas for the books. Those 12, each person who votes can choose 3, their 3 favorites. And in the end, we'll take the top 6. So please feel free to vote. And also, if you have contact with other of our regulars, because we're quite a small group today for some reason, let them know about that. I'll be posting it in the Facebook group as well. And I'll just find that other link that I told you about. pop that in there. And if you're not members of our Facebook group, and if you are on Facebook, I do encourage you to join us there as well, because we do chat about books from time to time. And it's a great way to let people know, for example, when there are surveys or when there's a link that's gone live for registration. Right, I might just stop the recording.
All right. Well, goodbye. Good night, everybody. Hope to see you
Night.
next month.